a quiet archive record. Tonight, we're stepping into a slow unfolding. Settle in, let the outside world dissolve, and gently descend into tonight's world. Tonight's story examines how ancient Mesopotamian myths and later interpretations turn Earth into a kind of archive, a place where divine names, broken emblems, and fragments of remembered authority settle into soil. Across king lists, flood epics, temple architecture, and the later legend of watchers, recurring motifs appear. Reigns that begin impossibly long and then contract, sacred objects that pass from hand to hand and then disappear, and monuments built as if a link to the sky could be engineered in mud brick. Parallels in Egypt and the growth of secrecy schools suggest a wider pattern of guarded knowledge and controlled remembrance. The record is uncertain, but the questions endure. This is Earth, the tomb of the Anunnakis. The word Anunnaki enters modern conversation as if it names a single, fixed idea. In the surviving cuneiform record, it does not. The term shifts by period, by city, and by genre. In some texts, the Anunnaki are the high gods associated with Anu, the sky. In others, they appear as a collective of divine authorities, sometimes linked with the underworld and judgment. The category behaves less like a roster and more like a label for a certain kind of power, an assembly, a court, a sanctioned order. That ambiguity matters because the story begins in documents that are already interpretive. The so-called Sumerian king list is not a neutral timeline. It is a political artifact that organizes legitimacy. It links cities through succession and claims continuity across ruptures. It also opens with a line that sets a tone: kingship descended from heaven. The phrase is not simply pious decoration. It establishes that authority is transferable, even portable, and that it originates from a realm beyond the ordinary human settlement. Within that framework, the earliest reigns are not merely long, they are vast. Antediluvian kings rule for tens of thousands of years. Names like Alulim and Alalngar stand at the front of the sequence, and the reign lengths read like a different physics of time. Then comes a dividing statement, repeated across versions in some form. The flood swept over. After the flood, the reigns diminish. They are still large at first, but the shrinkage is unmistakable. Over subsequent dynasties, the numbers settle into the range of ordinary human history. This pattern, long reigns shrinking, is one of the clearest recurring beats in Mesopotamian myth history. A literal reading makes immediate problems. Human biology does not support the idea. Archaeological periods do not align with the scale. The texts themselves exist in copies produced long after the events they claim to list. As a result, many scholars treat the numbers as symbolic, schematic, or numerological, rather than as straightforward biography. Mesopotamian mathematics used base 60, and large figures can function as statements of grandeur rather than measurements. In the sexagesimal system, large totals could also be expressed through named bundles. A 60, a NER 600, and a SR 3600. These units appear in mathematical and administrative contexts, and they make it easier to see how a list can be constructed as much as counted. Some antediluvian totals align with round, prestigious aggregates when expressed in these units, and later writers such as Berossus preserve a similar taste for monumental sums when describing pre-flood rulers. This does not prove that the numbers began as calculations. but it does show that the figures sit naturally inside a numerical culture that thought in large, well-structured blocks. The transmission history adds another layer. The king list survives in multiple manuscripts with differences in names, city sequences, and reign lengths. Copies were made in later schools, often for training, and a copied list can preserve local political preferences. In a world where scribes learned by reproducing authoritative models, a list could be stable in its overall shape, while remaining flexible in its details. That combination helps explain why the pattern is so persistent, even when the exact numbers shift. The contraction after the flood is a narrative spine, and the particular totals can be adjusted without breaking the intended message. One interpretive line argues that the long rains encode an antediluvian other time, not a chronology, but a mythic register in which the world is closer to the divine and therefore larger in every measure. When a catastrophic boundary event occurs, time collapses into the human scale. In this reading, the shrinking rains are a narrative device that marks distance from origins. Another interpretive line reads the rains as political rhetoric. A city that claims its founding king ruled for an impossible span is making a claim of primacy. It is saying, in effect, that its institution of kingship is not merely old, but foundational. By placing such a claim within a single list that hands kingship from city to city, the text can both honor local pride and establish an overarching order. The Anunnaki, in this context, function as the imagined guarantors of order, the divine assembly that can authorize the movement of kingship without making it arbitrary. The central question is not whether the numbers are true, but what they do. They build a world in which authority is older than any single dynasty, and where legitimacy is a substance that can be transferred, lost, regained, and measured in a style that looks like accounting. This is part of why the earth can be framed as a tomb in the metaphorical sense. The ground holds not only bodies and artifacts, but also the layered remains of competing claims about who had the right to rule. The king list is not alone in presenting a world in which the earliest era is qualitatively different. Flood epics, creation narratives, and temple hymns repeatedly treat early time as crowded with divine activity. Humans are made, taught, organized, and corrected. The story of civilization is described as instruction, not invention. In this setting, the Anunnaki can be approached as a mythic explanation for why certain structures exist. Law, hierarchy, record-keeping, ritual calendars, and the division of labor. Yet even within the mythic frame, instability is present. Divine assemblies disagree. Commands are debated. In some traditions, lesser divine beings perform labor and revolt, and humans are formed to take over the burden. Regardless of the exact text, a theme emerges. Order is costly. It requires enforcement, repetition, and memorialization. That memorialization becomes literal in clay tablets, seal impressions, and lists of names. The shrinkage of rains after the flood therefore serves as more than a numerical curiosity. It is an index of a broader contraction. The world becomes less saturated with overt divinity. The boundary between human and divine grows firmer. Authority still claims heavenly origin, but it must increasingly be managed through institutions, temples, scribal workshops, storehouses, and courts. Modern interpretations sometimes invert the mythic direction. Instead of reading the earliest era as symbolic, some fringe accounts treat it as a memory of lost technology. non-human rulers, or an advanced civilization wiped out by catastrophe. This documentary framing does not adopt those claims as fact. It notes that they exist as interpretations built on gaps, the distance between the numbers and the plausible. In such accounts, the Anunnaki become not an assembly of gods, but a group of beings whose reigns reflect a longer lifespan or a different nature. The shrinking reigns then become an echo of dilution, a gradual human takeover. Even without accepting the literal version, it is useful to ask why the pattern is compelling. A list that begins in impossible time and ends in ordinary time resembles a transition from myth to history. It provides a bridge for communities that want both, a sacred origin and a practical present. It can also be read as a confession. The older the claim, the less secure it is, and the more it must be inflated. In the material record, early Mesopotamian cities do not present evidence for rulers living tens of thousands of years. They do present evidence for intense continuity, temple rebuilding on the same platforms, repeated use of the same sacred precincts, and administrative systems that accumulate over centuries. The long reigns can therefore be read as a poetic translation of something real. Not lifespan, but persistence. A temple endures, a city name endures, a ritual endures. The king list compresses that endurance into the reign of a single figure, because kingship is the narrative vehicle it has chosen. The chapter closes on an archival principle. Time in these sources is constructed to support authority. When reigns shrink, it is not merely that years are fewer. It is that the world is becoming more human, more contested, and more dependent on objects, places, and records that can be lost. The tomb, in this sense, is not only a grave. It is the earth as storage, keeping what power once claimed and what later generations must piece together from fragments. A second layer to the time problem is how ancient scribes handled the relationship between numbers and authority. In Mesopotamia, lists were a standard form of knowledge organization. Lists of kings, lists of cities, lists of professions, lists of gods, lists of omens. The format is deceptively simple, but the effect is powerful. A list implies completeness. It implies that the compiler knows the entire field and can arrange it in an order that others must accept. When the king list presents reign lengths with exact-looking figures, it is borrowing the credibility of accounting. The base 60 system encourages that credibility. It allows clean divisions and large aggregates, and it is well suited to calendrical and astronomical work. That does not mean the king list is an astronomical document, but it does mean its numbers live inside a culture that treated number as an instrument of management. In such a culture, using very large figures can be more than exaggeration. It can be a way of placing early kings into a separate category, not simply older, but structurally different. The surviving manuscripts also show that the king list is not one text, but a family of texts. Variants shift spellings, reorder sequences, and adjust reign lengths. Cities rise and fall in prominence across periods, and lists can be re-edited accordingly. That is one reason to treat the opening era as a mythic front end, rather than a literal historical claim. A later political environment can expand or contract the ancient past as needed. In documentary terms, it is useful to separate three questions. First, what did the compilers want the audience to believe about legitimacy? Second, what older materials did they inherit or imitate? Third, What real institutional continuity did they experience that could be translated into long reigns? The answers can overlap. A stable temple cult can outlast dynasties. A city can persist even when its rulers change. A ritual calendar can continue through conquest. Those durable structures can be narrated as a single long reign because it provides a clean story of continuity. The contraction after the flood also has a social reading that does not require literal catastrophe. A flood line can operate as a narrative marker for any major rupture. City abandonment, regime change, or cultural reorientation. In that reading, the post-flood era is the era the compilers can measure with more confidence, and the pre-flood era is the era that is primarily inherited and stylized. Finally, the modern fascination with the Anunnaki often comes from the tension between list-like precision and historical uncertainty. The clay tablet looks factual. The numbers look official. Yet the content exceeds plausibility. That mismatch creates interpretive space, and that space is where both cautious scholarship and confident speculation compete. If kingship can descend from heaven, it can also be carried, represented, and symbolized. Across Mesopotamian art and text, authority is rarely presented as an abstract idea alone. It appears as things: staffs, rings, thrones, crowns, weapons, seals, and especially tablets. These objects do not merely decorate power, they embody it. They act as the interface between the human ruler and the claimed divine order. One of the most telling motifs is the Tablet of Destinies. In several mythic traditions, whoever holds a divine tablet holds the right to set fate, assign roles, and command other beings. The detail varies by text, but the underlying concept is consistent. Authority can be located in an object that can be stolen, recovered, or hidden. That object is a portable center of order. A well-known visual counterpart appears in royal monuments where a god extends a rod and ring to a king. On the Stele of Hammurabi, for example, the scene has often been read as the presentation of authority in a compact, graspable form. The symbolism does not require a single translation to be effective. A measuring line, a shepherd's staff, a signet, or a tool of judgment can all communicate the same idea that legitimacy is issued and can be received. The key point is that power is pictured as transferable and object-like, not merely as personal charisma. This object logic also helps explain why divine statues mattered so intensely. In many cities, cult images were treated as installed presences through complex rituals of preparation, washing, dressing, and feeding. The image was not simply displayed, it was maintained. When armies removed statues from temples, the action was recorded as both plunder and theological rupture. In that sense, a missing statue is an extreme form of a fading token. The city has lost its visible guarantee of protection, and the administrative system that depended on offerings and festivals is forced to improvise. The later boast of returning a statue is therefore not only piety, it is a claim that the correct network of obligation has been restored. This has a direct parallel in real administration. A sealed tablet in Mesopotamia is not just writing. It is a transaction, a contract, an inventory, or a legal decision. It is also a proof of identity, because the seal impression functions like a signature. When a tablet is broken, lost, or disputed, authority is disrupted. The system depends on preserved objects. Second motif is the set of divine me, decrees, powers, or cultural capacities. In some stories, these are distributed among gods and can be transferred. They define what a civilization is: craftsmanship, kingship, music, judgment, sexuality, truth-telling, deception, and countless other functions. The list changes, but the premise remains. The features of society are not accidental, and they can be taken away. When the me are disturbed, a city can be ruined. When they are restored, order returns. This is where the beat of fading objects of authority becomes central. In the mythic register, objects of power pass through hands. They are contested. They are sometimes lost to the depths, to distant lands, or to the underworld. In the historical register, objects of authority also fade, but by more ordinary processes: wars, looting, temple decay, and the simple vulnerability of perishable materials. Even when objects are durable, their meaning is not. A seal stone can survive, while the name it bears becomes unreadable. The Anunnaki, as a collective idea, hover over this problem. If authority is guaranteed by a divine assembly, then the objects that represent authority must be connected to that assembly. The temple statue of a god is treated as more than art. It is a presence. The offering table is not only food, it is an act of keeping the relationship alive. When the statue is carried off, it is a theological crisis as much as a political one. The city is not just conquered, it is abandoned by its protector. In many Mesopotamian inscriptions, kings boast of returning divine statues to their rightful temples. This is often described as restoration of cosmic order. A conquered statue becomes a trophy, and its return becomes a sign that the proper hierarchy is reasserted. The object is the center of authority, and its movement is the movement of legitimacy. The fading, then, happens on multiple levels. Objects physically disappear into the ground, and objects symbolically lose their certainty. A later king may claim to possess the same sanctioned authority as an earlier one, but the older claim is less checkable. It becomes a narrative supported by a chain of copied texts. The earth becomes the archive by default. Temples are rebuilt atop earlier temples. Floors rise as rubble is compacted. Clay tablets are baked in accidental fires and preserved by destruction. Ceilings break and fall into fill layers. A city mound accumulates like a layered file cabinet. In that mound, objects of authority are stored without intention. A scepter might never be found, but a fragment of a seal impression might survive long enough to identify an official who once served a palace that no longer exists. Within the mythic imagination, the underworld is not only a place of the dead, it is also a storehouse of confiscated power. The descent of a goddess, the judgment of kings, and the gathering of divine beings below ground all mirror a physical truth. The things of authority end up buried. In later interpretation, this can feel like a tomb for the Anunnaki themselves. Not because the gods are literally dead, but because the tokens of their world are now in the earth. A third motif emerges here: the gradual shift from charisma to bureaucracy. Early kings present themselves as chosen by gods, often as shepherds of a divine flock. Over time, the administrative record thickens, titles multiply, offices become routinized. The seal becomes as important as the sword. Authority is enacted through paperwork, ration lists, labor assignments, and temple accounts. This shift does not eliminate the divine frame. It embeds it. The sacred and the administrative are intertwined. The temple is both a ritual center and an economic institution. The palace is both a military center and a distribution node. Objects of authority, tablets, seals, boundary stones, anchor these institutions. Boundary stones, or kuduru, offer a strong example. They record land grants, privileges, and obligations. They invoke curses from gods against anyone who alters the terms. They are material law backed by divine threat. Their existence shows an anxiety about continuity, the fear that without an object to point to, authority will be contested. As dynasties fragment and cities compete, the idea of a single, unbroken descent of kingship becomes harder to maintain. The king list itself can be read as a response, an attempt to impose order on a political landscape that repeatedly breaks. In that environment, objects of authority take on heightened importance, because they provide continuity when human memory is disputed. Modern interpretations sometimes treat these objects as clues to lost technology, rods and rings as tools, tablets as data storage, ziggurats as platforms for contact. This documentary framing notes those readings as part of contemporary myth-making. The more grounded view is that ancient societies encoded authority in objects because objects outlast individual lives. When reigns shrink, when political centers move, and when disasters occur, objects become the anchors. But objects also betray vulnerability. They can be stolen, they can be broken, they can be forged, a seal can be copied, a tablet can be altered. The very reliance on objects makes authority fragile, and that fragility becomes a theme in the later imagination. The sense that something sanctioned has been lost. By the end of this chapter, the Earther's tomb metaphor is sharpened. The mound is not only debris, it is a record of how authority was repeatedly materialized and repeatedly buried. The Anunnaki, whether approached as gods, as symbols, or as later speculative rulers, are associated with the era when authority felt closer to the sky. The fading of authority's objects is the slow burial of that era into the ground. Cylinder seals make the object problem unusually concrete. A seal is small, portable, and personal, yet it carries institutional force. Rolled across wet clay, it produces a repeating scene. Gods, worshippers, animals, stars, and inscriptions naming an owner, and often an office. In administrative settings, the seal impression is the authentication step. Without it, a tablet is just text. With it, the tablet becomes a document. Seals also reveal how authority is negotiated. A powerful official may adopt divine imagery to align a personal role with cosmic order. A ruler may represent the self receiving symbols from a god, effectively staging legitimacy in miniature. Over time, the imagery shifts with political theology. That is another kind of fading. Not only the loss of objects, but the change in what those objects are allowed to mean. Royal inscriptions add another object-like layer. Bricks stamped with a king's name, foundation deposits, and dedicatory cones turn architecture into text. When a ruler rebuilds a wall or temple, the building carries a claim of rightful stewardship. When later builders reuse the same site, the earlier claim is literally under the new floor. Excavation then becomes a reading of stacked assertions. This stacking helps explain why lost authority becomes a recurring theme. A later regime inherits a landscape already marked by prior claims. It can either erase those claims, incorporate them, or reinterpret them. Each choice leaves different material traces. When a name is chiseled off a monument, the removal is itself evidence of political stress. In the mythology, The idea that a tablet or decree can be stolen makes sense in a world where documents can be seized in war. Archives are targets because they contain land grants, labor rosters, and fiscal obligations. Capturing tablets is capturing the administrative skeleton of a city. The mythic tablet of destinies is an exaggerated form of a real vulnerability. Order depends on records, and records can be taken. This documentary framing therefore treats objects of authority as a bridge between the divine register and the institutional register. Whether the Anunnaki are imagined as gods, as symbols, or as later speculative rulers, the narrative logic remains consistent. Authority has tokens. Tokens can be lost, and the ground becomes the storage medium when institutions fail. Among the most distinctive structures of Mesopotamia is the ziggurat, a staged tower-like platform built of mud brick, faced with baked brick and crowned by a temple. In surviving ruins and in literary description, it is simultaneously practical and symbolic. It elevates a sacred space above a flood-prone plain. It also declares a vertical axis between earth and heaven. The ziggurat is not a telescope, not a machine in the modern sense, and not a single unified design across all cities. It is a type. Its forms vary, its dates vary, and its rituals are often inferred rather than directly observed. Yet across those differences, a consistent logic emerges. Height matters. In hymn and inscription, ziggurats are described as mountains. That description is revealing because southern Mesopotamia has little natural elevation. To build a mountain is to import a feature the landscape lacks. The constructed height becomes a statement. The city can create an artificial horizon, a place where the divine can be approached on a raised stage. This is the beat of ziggurats as attempted links. The link is not always described as a literal staircase for gods, but the imagery is hard to miss. There are stairways, ramps, processional routes, and elevated sanctuaries. The movement upward is ritualized. The temple at the top is treated as the dwelling of the deity, or at least as the point of contact. In one reading, the ziggurat solves a theological problem created by the shrinking reigns and the fading objects of authority. As the world becomes more human and less overtly divine, architecture compensates. If the gods are distant, build higher. If kingship is less obviously sanctioned, place the sanction above ground in a monumental form. The structure becomes a permanent claim that the city remains connected to the heavens. The most famous later example, Etemenanki in Babylon, is often associated with the biblical Tower of Babel tradition, though the relationship is complex and filtered through later polemic. In Mesopotamian terms, the ziggurat is not about human arrogance for its own sake. It is about a city presenting itself as a cosmic center. Names given to such structures often translate into statements like house of the foundation of heaven and earth. The phrasing is not subtle. The building is imagined as a join. Specific examples show how long-lived this architectural claim could be. At Ur, the great ziggurat associated with the moon god Nana was rebuilt and refaced across centuries, with rulers leaving stamped bricks as a kind of time-stamped signature. The engineering is often practical, a mud brick core for bulk, baked brick for weathering, bitumen layers for water resistance, and drainage features to slow erosion. Even when later reconstructions cannot recover every detail of a vanished superstructure, The repeated repairs demonstrate that the link was not a one-time gesture. It was an ongoing obligation, a monument that demanded maintenance like a living institution. Other cities framed the idea more explicitly through naming. Nippur, for instance, could be described as a kind of axis point, a place where heaven and earth were conceptually tied together in cultic geography. Such language does not require that a tower functioned as a literal bridge. It shows that sacred architecture could serve as a map of order. The city situates itself inside a cosmos by declaring one place to be the junction. In that sense, the ziggurat is not only a skyline feature. It is a statement about where decisions are supposed to be made and where the sanctioned calendar is supposed to be kept. From a material perspective, ziggurats reveal the administrative capacity of a city. They require organized labor, sustained resource distribution, and long-term planning. Mud brick production must be coordinated. Bitumen and reeds may be used for stabilization. Baked brick facing requires fuel, kiln management, and logistics. Even without invoking the divine, the ziggurat is a document of centralized authority. That authority is not limited to the king. Temples, priesthoods, and scribal administrations are critical. The ziggurat sits within a complex that includes courtyards, storage rooms, workshops, and in some cities, archives. Tablets found in temple contexts show that record-keeping and ritual were intertwined. Offerings were counted. Labor was assigned. Calendars were maintained. The link to the sky is matched by a link to accounting. In the mythic imagination, building upward can also be an attempt to restore a lost closeness. If the antediluvian era is imagined as a time when divine beings moved more freely, then the later city may build the ziggurat as a corrective, an engineered proximity. The Anunnaki, as the divine council, become the implied audience. The ziggurat is a petition in brick. The ziggurat is also a response to water. Mesopotamia is shaped by rivers that can nourish and destroy. Flooding is a recurring reality, and later texts turn flood into a cosmic event. A raised platform protects the sacred center from ordinary inundation and symbolically claims superiority over chaos. In this sense, the ziggurat prefigures the flood reset theme. It is an assertion that order can be elevated above disaster. The structures were maintained over generations. They were repaired, refaced, and in some cases rebuilt. In inscriptions, kings claim to restore ziggurats in the name of gods, and those restorations function as political statements. A ruler who rebuilds a sacred link is presenting the reign as legitimate. This ties the architectural project to the earlier question of authority's objects. Here, the object is a building, too large to be carried away, but still vulnerable to decay. Decay is important. Ziggurats are not pyramids of stone. Mud brick erodes. Without constant maintenance, rain and wind reduce sharp edges to slopes. The shape returns to the mound. This physical tendency reinforces the archive metaphor. The link to the sky naturally collapses back into the earth. The city must continually reassert the link, or it fades. Modern observers sometimes interpret ziggurats through the lens of contact narratives, as if the structure were a landing platform or signal tower. The evidence does not require that conclusion. The more secure reading is that the ziggurat is a religious technology, a designed space that organizes attention, movement, and hierarchy. It stages a relationship between the city and the heavens. It makes the invisible order visible in form. The question of what the gods were in the minds of builders remains open. For some, gods are beings. For others, gods are personifications of forces and institutions. The Anunnaki can be treated in either mode. The ziggurat accommodates both. If gods are literal, the temple is a dwelling. If gods are symbolic, the temple is a focal point for collective order. In both cases, the structure is a claim. The city is not merely a settlement, it is an axis. The attempt to link worlds is not unique to Mesopotamia, and the later chapter will address parallels in Egypt. For now, the ziggurat stands as a concrete answer to a mythic problem. When the early world feels distant, build a ladder. When authority feels precarious, make it monumental. When objects of authority can be stolen, embed authority in architecture. The link is attempted not in theory, but in bricks, measured courses, and planned stairways. At the end of this chapter, the earth as tomb metaphor returns in a quiet way. The ziggurat is built to rise above the ground, but it is built from the ground. When abandoned, it becomes a tell, a mound, an archive layer. The attempted link becomes an archaeological feature. The skyward ambition becomes an earthen record. If the Anunnaki are understood as the high authorities of the old order, then ziggurats are among the most persistent material witnesses to the desire to remain within that order. The ziggurat of Ur, associated with the moon god Nana, offers a well-known example of how these monuments functioned as civic anchors. The structure dominates the city plan. It sits within a sacred precinct that also contains storage and administrative spaces. Later rulers repaired it to associate themselves with earlier glory. Each repair is a dated intervention, and together they show that the link had to be maintained in perpetuity. Building texts often emphasize correct materials, correct alignments, and correct ritual dedication. These details are not engineering notes alone. They are statements that the project followed the sanctioned order. A ziggurat built improperly would not merely be unsafe, it would be illegitimate. In this way, construction becomes a ritual act. The tower image also interacts with astronomy and calendrical practice. Mesopotamian priestly and scribal specialists tracked lunar cycles, intercalated months, and maintained festival schedules tied to seasonal agriculture. A high platform is an obvious place for observation, even if the primary function remains ritual. The point is not that a ziggurat is an observatory in the modern sense, but that elevated sacred space can support multiple institutional tasks: ritual display, procession staging, and the management of time. This supports the broader documentary argument about attempted links. A link is not only a mythic ladder, it is also an institutional bridge between the temple and the palace, between seasonal cycles and civic planning, between divine legitimacy and economic administration. The natural tendency of mud brick to erode without maintenance provides a literal timeline for cultural commitment. When a city can marshal labor to refinish a ziggurat, it signals cohesion. When it cannot, the structure slumps and returns to the mound. The archaeology then records not only the building, but the moment the building stopped mattering enough to save. The term watchers is most familiar from later Jewish apocalyptic literature, particularly the Book of Enoch, where a group of heavenly beings descends, takes oaths, and transgresses boundaries. In that tradition, the Watchers become a mythic explanation for the arrival of forbidden knowledge and for the corruption that precedes a catastrophic judgment. The story is not Mesopotamian in origin, and it should not be forced into direct identity with the Anunnaki. The Watcher's narrative also has a fairly traceable historical setting. Versions of Enochic material circulated in the Second Temple period, and fragments in Aramaic were preserved among the Dead Sea Scrolls, suggesting that the story functioned as a serious explanation for moral disorder and cultural anxiety, not merely as entertainment. In the classic form, the oath is taken at a named location, and the transgression is detailed in lists. Metallurgy, weapon making, adornment, and forms of star lore are presented as teachings that arrive out of proper sequence. The point is not that knowledge is evil. The point is that knowledge without authorization can reorganize a society faster than its moral framework can adapt. Some modern researchers have noticed that Mesopotamian traditions about antediluvian sages and later protective figures depicted in Neo-Assyrian art share a family resemblance with the Watchers as transmitters and guardians. The resemblance is not proof of direct borrowing in any single direction. It is a reminder that the ancient Near East repeatedly used the same structural pieces: supervised knowledge, boundary rules, and elite instruction. In every case, the oath is a shorthand for institutional permanence. It makes a group durable, and it turns responsibility into a shared burden that can be praised when it holds and condemned when it breaks. Yet the Watcher's narrative intersects with Mesopotamian themes in a way that has made it a persistent bridge in later interpretation. The intersection begins with the idea of a supervised world. Mesopotamian texts include divine councils, messenger gods, protective spirits, and classes of beings who serve in the maintenance of order. There are also traditions about sages, often called apkallu, associated with the transmission of knowledge to early kings. Later Mesopotamian lore sometimes frames certain sages as antediluvian and connects them to flood boundaries. While the details are not identical to Enosh, the structural components resonate. Early time, special knowledge, boundary crossing, and catastrophe. In the Watcher's story, the oath is central. The beings bind themselves together with a shared commitment, making the transgression collective and irreversible. In a documentary reading, the oath functions as a symbol of institutional solidarity. An oath is a technology for binding people to a rule in a way that survives individual preference. Oaths create groups that can act as one. This provides an entry point for the beat of Watcher's oath symbolism. Regardless of whether the Watchers are treated as literal beings or as mythic figures, the oath represents the moment when oversight becomes organized. A Watcher is not just an observer. A Watcher is accountable to a system. The oath is the mechanism that turns watching into authority. Mesopotamian societies were saturated with oaths. Contracts often invoked gods as witnesses. Legal disputes could be settled by sworn statements. Kings made treaties that called down divine curses on violators. Even the act of sealing a tablet can be seen as a kind of oath in clay, a commitment made public and anchored to a divine order. Boundary stones again provide a concrete example. The curse formulas on Kuduru are not casual threats. They are ritualized enforcement mechanisms. They treat the gods as watchers of legal boundaries. The person who breaks the agreement is not merely a criminal. That person is a violator of cosmic order. The divine realm is imagined as monitoring the human realm. In one reading, the Watcher's myth amplifies this legal theological reality into narrative drama. The beings who should enforce boundaries become the ones who cross them. The oath which should uphold order becomes the instrument of disorder. The story is therefore a cautionary inversion. The very structures that maintain civilization can generate crisis if misused. This matters for the Anunnaki theme because the Anunnaki, as a divine assembly, also represent sanctioned order. They are not simply powerful, they are authoritative. If the world is ruled by councils and decrees, then the integrity of that system depends on loyalty, oath, and proper function. A myth about watchers swearing an oath to break rules becomes a myth about the failure of supervision. In later speculative traditions, the watchers are sometimes conflated with the Anunnaki or treated as a related class of beings. This documentary framing does not treat that conflation as established. It treats it as a modern synthesis that uses similarity of roles, watchers, teachers, rulers, to connect otherwise distinct traditions. The synthesis is part of how contemporary audiences build a single storyline across cultures. Even without conflation, a comparison reveals shared anxieties. Both Mesopotamian and Enochic materials wrestle with knowledge. Knowledge can civilize. Knowledge can also destabilize. Lists of crafts, technologies, and rituals appear as gifts and as dangers. The question is not whether knowledge exists, but who controls it. This is where secrecy enters, though the full development will come later. Knowledge is often guarded by institutions, temples, priesthoods, and scribal schools. The scribal curriculum itself has a boundary function. Not everyone learns to write. Not everyone handles the ritual language. The school becomes a controlled channel for preserved knowledge. Within that environment, the Watcher's Oath can symbolize the formation of a counter-institution, a group that shares knowledge outside authorized channels. The oath is the boundary that keeps insiders in and outsiders out. In historical terms, secret societies and initiated priestly groups operate similarly, though without the cosmic drama. The myth gives a memorable shape to the social fact. There is also a psychological dimension. A watcher implies surveillance. Surveillance implies that actions matter even when unobserved by humans. In societies where law is tied to divine witness, the watcher is the imagined presence that makes the law internal. Oath and watcher together create self-regulation. When the myth depicts watchers failing, it exposes the fear that the system depends on its guardians. Some interpretations treat the watcher's story as a memory of political elites who claimed divine origin and hoarded technical knowledge. Others treat it as a theological explanation for why suffering exists despite an ordered cosmos. Still others treat it as an allegory about mixed marriages, cultural boundaries, and the loss of identity. The point here is not to settle the question, but to note that the oath motif is adaptable because it speaks to real mechanisms. Binding agreements, shared guilt, and collective identity. Returning to Mesopotamia, the divine council scenes in myth often involve debate and decision. The gods do not always speak with one voice. When decrees are made, they are made through authority structures. If the Anunnaki are imagined as the council that decides fate, then their decrees function like cosmic oaths. They are commitments that structure reality. The earth as tomb metaphor takes on a quieter meaning in this chapter. Oaths are not physical objects, but they leave traces. They leave texts, curses, treaty clauses, and stories. These traces survive as tablets in the ground. The oath becomes archaeological when it is written. The watcher becomes archaeological when the symbol is carved on a stone or invoked in a formula. Oversight becomes a line in a contract, preserved by accident, read millennia later by someone trying to reconstruct a world that bound itself together with words. By the end of this chapter, the Watchers are positioned not as a replacement for Mesopotamian gods, but as a later lens that intensifies themes already present: supervision, transgression, knowledge, and the binding force of oath. In that lens, the Anunnaki can be seen as the imagined administrators of a world where order is fragile and constantly enforced. The oath is the tool that holds the assembly together. The Watcher is the role that makes enforcement possible. The myth is a reminder that even the guardians in human imagination can fail. The Mesopotamian Apkallu tradition is relevant here because it offers a structured myth about knowledge transmission. The Apkallu are often portrayed as sages connected with the earliest kings, sometimes described as semi-divine. Later lists and traditions classify them, name them, and associate them with instruction in crafts and ritual order. In some late materials, certain Apkallu are treated as proper and others as dangerous, especially in relation to the flood boundary. That internal classification resembles the Watcher's logic. Knowledge is not simply given, it is monitored. Some instruction is authorized, some is treated as a boundary violation. The Watcher's myth expresses that boundary violation through oath and dissent. Mesopotamian tradition expresses it through the management of sages and the post-flood restriction of certain powers. Oaths in the real documentary record are also not only legal, they are political instruments. Treaties between states use formulaic language to bind parties under divine witness. The penalty sections are extensive because the text is designed to survive leadership turnover. A future ruler inherits the oath as a constraint, which is one reason oath language is so detailed. This helps clarify why modern audiences repeatedly attach oath narratives to ancient keepers of knowledge. An oath is the simplest narrative way to explain continuity in an institution that outlives individuals. If a group claims specialized knowledge, an oath provides the mechanism by which the knowledge stays inside the group. Whether such oaths were formalized in any given context varies, but the social logic is consistent. In documentary style, the Watchers function here as a comparative case. They show how later cultures repackage earlier themes: supervision, knowledge control, boundary crossing, and catastrophe. The Anunnaki remain a Mesopotamian category, but the Watchers become a lens that modern interpretation uses to stretch Mesopotamian motifs across time. Flood stories are among the most widely shared mythic structures across cultures, but the Mesopotamian versions are particularly well documented. The Atrahasis narrative, the flood episode in the Epic of Gilgamesh, and related fragments describe a decision by the gods to send a deluge and a counter-decision by a sympathetic deity to preserve a human survivor, along with animals and supplies. The details vary: the reasons for the flood, the nature of the warning, and the aftermath. Yet the core beat is stable. A catastrophic water event functions as a reset. In the Sumerian king list, the flood is the hinge. Before it, rains are enormous. After it, rains shrink. This alignment makes the flood not simply a disaster, but a temporal boundary. It divides the world into two modes. The mythic era is ended, and the historical era begins. The flood reset theme also serves an explanatory function. It answers why evidence is missing. If an earlier world existed, its monuments and records might be gone because water erased them. If a certain knowledge once existed, its loss can be blamed on the reset. The flood becomes a narrative solvent that dissolves inconvenient continuity. From an archaeological perspective, Mesopotamia has experienced significant flooding. River shifts and inundations can destroy settlements and deposit layers of silt. Some early excavations reported flood layers at certain sites, though their regional scope varies and they do not establish a single global event. The scientific view generally treats flood myths as amplifications of real local catastrophes combined with theological reflection. The modern recovery of these stories underscores the archival theme. Many key flood texts were reconstructed from tablets found in the ruins of palaces and libraries, including the collections associated with Assyrian kings who prized ancient scholarship. In the 19th century, when cuneiform decipherment matured, fragments from Nineveh and elsewhere allowed translators to recognize the flood episode within Gilgamesh and to compare it with older and parallel traditions. The effect was not merely academic. It demonstrated that a story could survive as a set of broken pieces, carried forward by copyists who sometimes labeled their work as a faithful reproduction of an earlier original. Those colophons and copying habits matter because they show how a reset can be remembered without a single uninterrupted manuscript line. A tablet might be described as a copy of an old tablet, written for a school, checked against a model, and then stored. That chain of preservation is an ordinary human analogue to the mythic act of sealing knowledge in the ground. It also explains why flood narratives can be both stable and variable. Stable in their scaffolding, variable in their motives and details, because each copying community has its own anxieties. The archive of survival is therefore not one vault. It is a network of workshops that keep rebuilding the text after every disruption. This documentary framing stays with that approach. The flood is a mythic consolidation of repeated reality. What matters for the Anunnaki theme is how the flood is administered. In the epics, the gods debate. Some want destruction, others resist it. The decision is framed as judicial. The flood is punishment, correction, or relief from human noise, depending on the version. The divine assembly acts like a council of state, and the deluge becomes an extreme policy. The flood also raises a second critical beat: preserved knowledge. If the flood resets the world, what survives is not only life, but instruction. The survivor in many versions offers sacrifices afterward and receives continued guidance. Civilization is not reinvented from scratch. It is restarted with memory. Later, historical writers amplify this idea. Berossus, a Babylonian priest writing in the Hellenistic period, describes a flood survivor who buries writings in a city before the deluge so they can be recovered afterward. The details are filtered through later transmission, but the motif is clear. The pre-flood world anticipates destruction and stores knowledge in the earth for later retrieval. The earth becomes an archive by design, not only by accident. This motif has a powerful afterlife. It supports the idea that certain discoveries are not inventions, but recoveries. Mathematics, astronomy, and ritual calendars can be framed as ancient inheritances. When later scribes copy older texts, the act can be interpreted as preservation of antediluvian wisdom, even if the originals are already lost. In Mesopotamia, libraries and tablet collections were real institutions. Temples and palaces stored administrative records and literary texts. The survival of these archives often depended on catastrophe. A fire that destroys a building can bake clay tablets, making them more durable. A collapse can bury them. The very events that end a city's political life can preserve its paperwork for millennia. This creates a paradox. Destruction is a preservative. The flood, as the mythic destruction, becomes the ultimate preservative in narrative. It can justify why knowledge exists in fragments, because only what was stored, copied, or carried survived. In the mythic register, preserved knowledge is also contested. Some knowledge is permitted, some forbidden. The Watcher's narrative frames certain teachings as illicit. Mesopotamian stories sometimes frame certain divine powers as dangerous to distribute. The me can be stolen. The tablet of destinies can be seized. Knowledge is not neutral. It is a form of authority. The flood, then, can be read as a reset not only of population, but of control. After catastrophe, institutions can be rebuilt with new hierarchies. The shrinking reigns in the king list may reflect this, a world where divine authorization is still claimed, but the scale is reduced. The post-flood kings are closer to ordinary human limits, and their authority must be constructed through more visible institutions. There is also an ethical dimension in the narratives. The flood raises questions about justice. Why should many suffer for the faults of some? Why do sympathetic gods resist? These questions are part of why the story persists. A council that can send a flood is a council of overwhelming power, and the Anunnaki, as a label for the high authorities, become associated with the severity of the old order. Modern speculative readings often push this further. They interpret the flood as an engineered event, a deliberate reset by advanced beings to control a population, erase a rival, or restart an experiment. In those accounts, preserved knowledge is a remnant of a prior stage, hidden in the earth. This documentary framing does not accept that scenario as established. It notes that the structure of the myth, council decision, reset, preservation, restart, is compatible with such speculation, which is part of why the speculation spreads. Within the more grounded frame, the flood story performs social work. It teaches that order can be revoked. It warns that noise, injustice, or boundary violation can provoke cosmic response. It also reassures that survival is possible through obedience, piety, and foresight. The survivor becomes the model of disciplined continuity. The flood also has practical echoes. Mesopotamian cities depended on water management. Canals required maintenance. Floods required response. A story that elevates flood to cosmic reset is an extension of a society that already lived with water as both provider and threat. The myth expresses an environmental truth in theological language. The archives of survival are not only tablets and stories. They are also institutions. Scribal schools train new generations to copy old texts. Temple rites repeat established sequences. Calendars maintain seasonal order. These are forms of preserved knowledge that outlast individual lives and even political regimes. By the end of this chapter, the Earth as tomb metaphor is nearly literal. Knowledge is buried in clay, in broken buildings, in filled-in rooms. In myth, knowledge is buried intentionally to survive the flood. The tomb is not only where things end, it is where things are stored for inheritance. The flood resets the surface, but the ground keeps what was placed within it. The Anunnaki, as the mythic administrators of order and catastrophe, become linked to the logic of preservation. If authority can destroy, it can also instruct how to endure. The flood reset motif also connects to an administrative reality. Cities on river plains are built for continuity but exposed to interruption. When a canal silts up or a river shifts course, the economic basis of a settlement can collapse. A major flood can also destroy stored grain, displace labor, and force relocation. Even if the event is local, the human experience of it can feel total. Texts such as Atrahasis also preserve a model of governance in crisis. The divine assembly debates policy, a dissenting deity leaks information, and a survivor carries out a compliance plan. This is a recognizable political narrative. It explains catastrophe as a result of decision-making, not random misfortune. Preserved knowledge is therefore not only a romantic idea, it is a practical necessity. After disruption, institutions must restart. Tax systems, labor assignments, irrigation schedules, ritual calendars. The reason archives matter is that they reduce restart costs. A tablet collection is a memory device for the state. The Berossus motif of buried writings extends that logic into a mythic extreme. If the state expects a reset, it secures its memory underground. This is also the simplest narrative explanation for why later generations would recover fragments, because earlier generations anticipated the need. The documentary stance remains cautious. No single global flood is required to explain the myth, and the archaeological record does not compel that conclusion. What the evidence supports is a long history of flooding and rupture, combined with literate institutions capable of turning repeated experience into a single, formal story. Another reason the flood remains persuasive is that it simplifies a complex archaeological landscape into one clean hinge. Settlement sequences in southern Mesopotamia include episodes of abandonment, rebuilding, and relocation that can be driven by shifting waterways, salinization, conflict, and administrative collapse. A unified flood story turns many disruptions into one event that can be dated, remembered, and moralized. It also makes room for a familiar pattern of legitimacy, the ruler or institution that restores after catastrophe can claim a special right to reorganize land, labor, and cult. In that sense, the flood is also a narrative about authority reconstitution. The old order is judged insufficient. The reset clears the surface. A new order is installed with a renewed claim to sanction. Whether the Anunnaki are treated as literal gods or as the mythic language of institutional power, the logic is consistent. Catastrophe authorizes reorganization, and reorganization is presented as restoration. Parallels between Mesopotamia and Egypt invite both caution and curiosity. The two regions developed in different environments and with distinct languages, political structures, and religious systems. Direct borrowing occurred at times through trade and diplomacy, but broad similarities can also emerge independently when complex societies solve similar problems. The aim here is not to collapse them into one culture, but to observe recurring patterns that later interpretation often uses to build a single narrative about ancient authority. One pattern is the handling of time and kingship. Egypt has king lists, dynastic histories, and traditions that extend beyond recorded history into an era of gods and semi-divine rulers. Later writers such as Manetho, preserved through later sources, describe periods in which gods and spirits ruled before human dynasties. The durations can be very long, while the exact numbers and their transmission are debated. The structural resemblance to Mesopotamian antediluvian reigns is notable. An early era of extended rule followed by a contraction into human time. This is another appearance of long reigns shrinking, now in a different cultural register. The Egyptian record shows, in its own way, the same tension between display and documentation. Monumental king lists carved on temple walls present idealized sequences, sometimes omitting rulers who were politically inconvenient. Administrative sources, such as the Turin king list and the Palermo stone fragments, preserve a different kind of memory, regnal years, events, and a sense that the past can be arranged into a controlled series. Even when these sources are damaged and incomplete, the existence of multiple list types indicates that the question of continuity was managed through paperwork as much as through myth. A long pre-dynastic or divine era can therefore be understood as a narrative horizon that makes later institutions feel anchored, while the practical lists try to keep time in a way that supports taxation, building projects, and ritual schedules. Knowledge control in Egypt also had mundane roots. Temple complexes were economic centers, as well as religious ones, and the scribal class was trained through repetitive copying and restricted access. Terms translated as House of Life suggest a setting where texts were curated, reproduced, and guarded, particularly when they were tied to ritual performance or technical expertise, such as medicine and calendrics. Later, Mediterranean writers transformed this restricted professionalism into a romance of secrets, and modern readers sometimes extend the romance backward into deep antiquity. The more cautious view is that the silence was functional. An institution protects its legitimacy by controlling who can speak its language. In both Egypt and Mesopotamia, that control helped ensure survival, but it also ensured that the inheritance would arrive in fragments. The pattern suggests a common mythic function: to place the origin of order in an earlier, larger world, and to present the present as a reduced, more fragile continuation. Another parallel is the materialization of authority. Egypt, like Mesopotamia, encodes rule in objects: crowns of Upper and Lower Egypt, the crook and flail, the ankh, the scepter, the djed pillar, and the sealed decree. Pharaoh is not only a person, but an office that carries symbols and ritual actions. The maintenance of Ma'at, order, balance, truth, is a cosmic duty enacted through ceremonies and administration. These objects of authority also fade. Tomb robbing, political upheaval, and religious change cause symbols to be hidden, repurposed, or destroyed. Names are erased from monuments, statues are moved, temples are defaced. The physical survival of objects does not guarantee the survival of their sanctioned meaning. A third parallel is monumental architecture as a link. Egypt is famous for pyramids rather than ziggurats, and the engineering principles differ. Yet the symbolic direction is similar: elevation, alignment, and the creation of a sacred axis. Pyramids, temples, and obelisks structure the landscape in a way that ties kingship to the sky. through solar theology, star alignments, and the idea of ascent. This does not mean that pyramids are ziggurats in stone. It means that both cultures used height and geometry to address a shared problem: how to represent a connection between human authority and a transcendent order. Ziggurats are stepped platforms with temples on top. Pyramids are sealed mountains for royal transformation. Both create an engineered horizon. In later interpretations that connect Egypt to Mesopotamian divine councils, the Anunnaki sometimes appear as a proposed link, a name used to suggest that a single external authority influenced multiple civilizations. This documentary framing treats that claim as speculative and often modern. In the primary sources, Egypt does not use the term, and Mesopotamia does not describe Egypt in those terms. The parallel lies in structure, not in shared labels. Where the connection becomes most concrete is in institutions of knowledge. Both regions developed specialized schools. In Mesopotamia, scribal training involved copying sign lists, lexical texts, proverbs, and administrative formats. In Egypt, scribal culture also formed a professional class, with training, formulaic writing, and institutional memory. Both cultures tied knowledge to the temple and to the state. This is the entry to the secrecy schools beat. Secrecy schools can mean many things, and the phrase can easily become misleading. In the strict historical sense, temple schools were not necessarily secret societies. They were restricted institutions. Literacy itself is a form of restriction. The curriculum can be guarded. Ritual knowledge can be limited to initiates. Certain texts may be reserved for specialists. The result is a system where knowledge is both preserved and controlled. Egypt's House of Life is often described as a temple-associated institution involved in copying and maintaining texts, including ritual, medical, and mythic materials. Mesopotamian temple archives function similarly in practice, even if the institutional labels differ. In both cases, the preservation of knowledge is tied to a hierarchy. Those who hold the writing hold a form of authority. Over time, especially in the Hellenistic and Roman periods, Egyptian religious ideas become part of wider Mediterranean currents. Hermetic texts, mystery cults, and philosophical schools develop initiation structures. The image of Egypt as a land of hidden wisdom becomes a cultural motif. In that environment, the idea of a guarded ancient inheritance is amplified. This amplification loops back to Mesopotamia through later scholarship and esoteric synthesis. When ancient languages are rediscovered and deciphered, modern readers encounter vast archives of myth and administration. The gap between the ancient and the modern creates a space where secrecy narratives grow. If the ancients knew something and the modern world forgot it, then perhaps it was hidden intentionally. The earth itself, holding tablets and tombs, becomes the imagined vault. In the more cautious frame, the secrecy is structural, not conspiratorial. Complex societies require specialized knowledge, and specialization produces restricted access. Archives are controlled because they are power. Rituals are controlled because they maintain legitimacy. Even without an organized plot, the outcome can resemble secrecy. A small class holds the keys to the symbolic system. This brings the chapter to inheritance. The idea of preserved knowledge is not only about texts, it is about practices: how to measure time, how to allocate labor, how to maintain irrigation, how to build monuments, how to perform rites. Some of these practices survive through direct continuity. Others survive through rediscovery. Others are reconstructed by modern scholarship from broken evidence. The earth as tomb metaphor becomes a final interpretive frame. A tomb is a container. It can be protective, but it can also be silent. Much of the ancient world does not speak directly. It speaks through fragments. Tablets break. Inscriptions weather. Contexts are disturbed. The inheritance is therefore incomplete. And that incompleteness is not a failure of modern effort, but a condition of time. If the Anunnaki are treated as gods, then the tomb is the world that no longer directly experiences their presence. If the Anunnaki are treated as symbols of authority, then the tomb is the set of institutions that buried their own origins under layers of rebuild and reform. If the Anunnaki are treated in later speculation as a class of rulers, then the tomb is the earth that contains artifacts that may never be fully interpreted. The responsible conclusion does not require a single answer. It requires recognizing the recurring beats and what they reveal about human memory. Long reigns shrink because origins are magnified. Objects of authority fade because material culture is fragile, and because legitimacy must be continually reasserted. Ziggurats rise because the sky remains a compelling direction for meaning. Watchers and oaths appear because societies understand that supervision and binding promises create order, and because the fear of their failure is permanent. Flood resets appear because catastrophe is both real and narratively useful. Preserved knowledge appears because continuity matters, and because archives, whether in temples or in soil, are the means by which continuity is attempted. What remains at the end is silence, not as emptiness, but as the condition of inheritance. The earth holds what can no longer speak without interpretation. Modern readers and researchers stand at the edge of that archive, translating marks into narratives, aware that every reconstruction leaves something unspoken. In that silence, the ancient claim persists. That authority once came from above, that it was enacted through objects and institutions, and that its traces are now underfoot, waiting in layers. Egyptian claims about divine kingship and cosmic order are framed differently than Mesopotamian council mythology. But the administrative consequence is similar, a state that ties legitimacy to sacred maintenance. In Egypt, the pharaoh's role in sustaining Mayat is not merely symbolic. It justifies taxation, labor mobilization, and monumental projects. In Mesopotamia, the king's relationship to a city god and temple complex performs comparable work. The comparison also extends to professionalization. Egyptian scribes trained in hieroglyphic, hieratic, and later demotic scripts, with a curriculum that mixed practical record-keeping and formal compositions. Mesopotamian scribes trained in sign lists, lexical series, and model contracts. In both cases, writing is not evenly distributed. It is a gatekeeping tool. When later periods build a mythology of secrecy, they often project backward onto these gatekeeping structures. A restricted literacy environment can look like a deliberate concealment. In practice, it is often a labor economics problem. Training is costly, and institutions limited to those who serve institutional needs. The concept of schools of secrecy can still be used, but only with careful definition. It refers to restricted knowledge environments rather than to a single, unified, hidden order. This framing keeps the discussion grounded while acknowledging why the motif persists in popular accounts. The closing emphasis on silence is therefore an archival observation. Much of what is most interesting about these cultures is reconstructed indirectly, from broken tablets, partial king lists, reused bricks, and later retellings that blend genres. The inheritance is real, but it is incomplete, and the space between fragments is where interpretation enters. A documentary conclusion can only hold the pieces together, not seal them. The Anunnaki, the Watchers, the Flood, the Towers, the Lists, and the Schools are all ways cultures describe the same pressure points: how order begins, how it is maintained, and how it fails. The details differ by tradition, and later readers often stitch them into a single storyline. The archive pushes back against that certainty. It preserves enough to invite reconstruction and enough silence to require restraint. In practical terms, the safest approach is to track what kind of source is being used at any moment. King lists and hymns argue for legitimacy. Epics and myths explain suffering and order. Administrative tablets record transactions without attempting to be cosmology. Later writers, translating older traditions, reshape them to fit new audiences. When those layers are kept distinct, the story becomes less sensational, but more coherent. That coherence is the point of the archive approach. It allows wonder without demanding certainty, and it allows speculation to be labeled as speculation rather than smuggled in as fact. It is a way to keep the record honest. And that is enough for tonight. This was a quiet archive story, where the story ends, sleep begins,